Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for this edition of the Antiquities Coalition Digs In. I'm Peter Herdrick, the co-founder of the Antiquities Coalition, and today we're talking with Dr. Elizabeth Rodini, the author of Gentile Bellini's Portrait of Sultan Mehmet II, Lives and Afterlives of an Iconic Image. Dr. Rodini is the Andrew High School Arts Director at the American Academy in Rome, one of the most active organizations in the world in promoting arts and cultural creation, research, and understanding. Previously, she founded the program in Museums and Society at Johns Hopkins University, where she was a teaching professor in the history of art. Welcome, Dr. Rodini.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Your book discusses the lives and afterlives of Gentile Bellini's Portrait of Sultan Mehmet II, the conqueror of Constantinople who brought an end to the Byzantine Empire. Well, you can't have a portrait without a subject and a painter, so let's start with these two figures. Who was the portraitist and who was the potentate? Starting with the man known as the conqueror, or Fatih, Mehmet II.
So Mehmet II, known in Turkish even today as Fatih, which means conqueror, was one of the most important leaders of the Ottoman Empire. And as you mentioned, he is the Sultan who conquered Constantinople, brought an end to the Byzantine Empire, and really seeded the growth of the Ottoman Empire and remade Constantinople as his capital in Istanbul, calling it Istanbul. And Gentile Bellini was a painter from Venice, the eldest son of Jacopo Bellini, and older brother to Giovanni Bellini, a very important family of Venetian painters. And Gentile ended up in the Sultan's court as part of a sort of diplomatic retinue that was sent to the Ottoman Empire at Mehmet's request.
Great. And as for Gentile, the Venetian painter, can you give us some context on him and how it happened that he got to Istanbul to paint what has become the best known image of this Sultan of the Ottoman Empire?
Right. Well, it's a little bit of a chance. It was not that Gentile himself was called by the Sultan. Mehmet II was an extremely active, engaged patron of many things, of architecture, of technology. He was very interested in history and literature and classics. And so he would use his power to bring artists and engineers and architects from all over the known world to his court. And he sent an envoy to the Venetians to bring some artists to his court. And he is reported to ask for someone who was good at making ritratti, which we translate today as portraits. And Gentile was chosen. He was one of the most respected painters of his day. He was a portraitist to the Doge, the ruler of Venice. And although today his younger brother is maybe the more well-regarded and well-known, Gentile was an extremely successful painter in his own day. And I should say this is in the year 1479. So we're talking the latter part of the 15th century.
So that was just before Mehmet passed away.
Yes, he died in 1481, shortly after the portrait was completed in November of 1480. And his conquest of Constantinople was in 1453. So he had about 30 years to remake the city and really, aggrandize it, build some incredibly important works of architecture, remake the Hagia Sophia into a mosque and many other things like that. So he had really left a very significant mark on the city.
Well, that's interesting because you make that, picking up on that, you make the very salient point that this episode, the actual meeting of the potentate and the portraitist, if you will, was an episode of cultural diplomacy. It was a request for a painter by the Ottoman Sultan, greeted by the Venetians with the selection of Gentile, who was Venice's most revered contemporary portraitist, I understand from your book, to travel to Istanbul. So this really was art in service to diplomacy in the Renaissance.
Mm-hmm. It was. I mean, the relationships between the Ottoman Empire and the Venetian Republic were rocky at best. They were on and off at war constantly. So you can see this is a moment of détente, let's say, of the Ottomans approaching the Venetians and the Venetians acquiescing. And this sort of peace didn't last. There were ongoing wars. But absolutely, this was a kind of way of, and of course, presentations of gifts. You could see Gentile almost as a gift. And one thing I do talk about in the book is that the Sultan ended up with a copy of a sketchbook by Gentile's father, Jacopo. And I suspect that it was Gentile that brought him this book. And that to me speaks to the Sultan's interest in really the craft of painting that was being developed. He wasn't just sort of interested in the trophy artist. He was interested in, well, what is this guy doing and how does he work? At least that's what I argue in the book, that he was a really, a very curious, engaged patron. He wasn't just sort of seeking trophies. He really wanted to understand the craft of, this new Italian painting that was being developed and that was written about widely and really becoming very famous. And by that, I mean a sort of rise in a sort of naturalism that we associate with the Renaissance.
Mhm. And that seems, I was intrigued by that, the episode you talk about with the collection of instructional materials that Gentile brought from his father Jacopo, and so it reflects too on Mehmet as a cosmopolitan person of his own right. And from what I understand, he was technologically oriented, and or I understand this from reading your book, I should say, he was technologically oriented. He really had quite a great interest in many polymathic subjects.
Absolutely. I mean, he's reported to have studied ancient languages. He brought engineers who built, sort of state of the art fortresses. He probably collected maps. So he was interested in geography and the ways the world got represented. It's reported that he had a collection of Christian objects. So why? Probably because he was a sort of omnivorous, curious individual. And this was part of the world he was living in. And then, of course, there's the question that always comes up about, well, was a Muslim allowed to have a realistic portrait like this? And that, there's a misunderstanding that is absolute, that it's not permitted. In fact, the kind of dictates along those lines are much more complicated than that. And a sultan could do pretty much whatever he wanted. But it is striking that one of the things he seems to have been interested in as well, what can painting do? What is the ability of painting under a skilled artist like Gentile Bellini to capture the world as we see it? And in my book, I argue that that's really one of the things Mehmet, was interested in. And we have various kind of hints of that from the very scanty documents that survive.
Well, you've done a terrific job with scanty documents to fill in a long story, and that's what I want to move to next. And readers might think that this pair of historic figures would make intriguing protagonists, and they would, except that the book is not about these protagonists. It's actually about the painting itself. And you write this, and I want to quote it for you. You write that this story is not of a picture hanging on a wall, but of a canvas that has journeyed across time and space. And further, you write, the painting's presence has less to do with its essence as a work of art than the larger circumstances that it represents, less for what it is than for what it stands for. Mm-hmm. Now, you call the book an object biography. Can you tell us what you mean by that?
Yes, I'm interested in tracing this object from when it was produced to the present. So just like we would write a biography of a person, and often art history focuses on the moment of creation, or maybe more radically, let's say, on how it's presented in the present, but the sort of in between often gets left out. So that's what I mean by a biography. The subtitle of my book is Lives and Afterlives of an Iconic Image. And by that, I mean, by the life, I mean, where was this thing at any given time and what happened to it? So that's the biography. The afterlife, I really think of as, well, what are the ideas that circulated around it? What, as we'll discuss, perhaps it was missing for 400 years, but it was known. So what was its fame? How does it resonate in memory? What happens when it gets reproduced in photography? What happens? How does it play out in the Turkish imagination? So that's sort of what I mean by afterlife. What are the ideas that circulate around it, either very close to it or farther away, but always kind of orbiting in some way the painting itself.
Very interesting, and I do want to talk about a number of those themes and issues that you bring up. I want to start though with how you open your book, and it's a trip to see the portrait at the National Gallery in London, where it decidedly did not occupy a lofty site in a featured gallery.
No, this was 2003 is when I first saw it, and it was in the lower level of, also known as the basement of the National Gallery, in I think what was called Room A. And this was an area of the gallery set aside for, what they would consider, what the National Gallery might consider problem works or lesser works, works that were damaged, that were sort of second rate by great masters, that had questionable attributions. Now, in many museums, these works would have been the highlights of a collection, but in a collection like the National Gallery, your sort of casts-offs are still often pretty good paintings. And it was there for a number of reasons that are important to my book. One is that it's not in great condition. It's heavily restored. Some say probably about 90% of the paint is not original. So this begs a lot of questions about authenticity and authorship. And there have been, over the course of the 150 years or so since it's reappeared, some questions about whether it is actually the work that Gentile Bellini painted. So, all of these things came into play in how I decided to tell this story also, because I was, I think, understandably nervous about building a whole story around an assumption that this is that painting. I was much more interested in thinking about what do we come to believe about it based on what we know about it, and how has this changed? So at a certain point, after it had been really kind of a much revered part of the collection in the early 20th century, it was reevaluated and considered to be more problematic and set down to the lower level of the museum. And that's where I first saw it. And it was disappointing to me. It was smaller, it was darker, it wasn't what I had imagined. So that spurred me to keep thinking about how it had come to occupy this place in my own imagination as well.
Well, that's really interesting, and it brings up, I think, one of the real strengths of your book, which is the fact that you have this terrific narrative of how it started, how its origins, and it goes through 500 years of history, and yet at the same time you bring up some terrific ideas around like the intellectual history, the analysis of this. But in some ways, I think now might be a good point, really, for us to just take a look at the portrait itself. And I wonder if you could, I'm sure you know it probably better than anyone almost, but could you describe it for us? What do you see when you look at the portrait?
I'm looking at a little image of it right here. So it represents a turbaned man in red robes with a fur mantle over his shoulders, and he sits in a not quite profile. He's probably, I would say, in sort of 7/8 profile. So we see his aquiline nose with just a hint of the eye that's kind of hidden behind his nose. And he sits behind an arch that looks very much to me like mid 15th century Venetian architecture. It's sort of a faux marble carved arch, and behind a parapet on which is draped a textile, a sort of jeweled textile. And there's an inscription that's very much damaged on the base of this arch that is essentially describes who we're looking at, and is signed by Gentile Bellini and actually dated to November 1480. And all of this sort of sits in front of a very stark black background with 3 crowns floating on either side of the Sultan, which are probably either emblems of the 3 territories that he ruled over as the Ottoman Sultan, or perhaps together there are 6 crowns, and then one on the textile represent him as the 7th Sultan in the dynasty. But it is an odd composition, and some of its oddities and maybe awkwardness, because sometimes is the Sultan behind the arch? Is he under the arch? It's not quite clear. Might have to do with damage to the canvas and repainting. So that's another thing, that you have to be careful with when dealing with an object like this is, how much you can rely on what your eyes tell you, and how much that is a later reworking of the picture. So I have studied some of the conservation records, the X-ray images that have been made of it to understand, and read a lot of what I can about its conservation to understand how the image we see relates to the historic image. And it seems that it's quite close to what Bellini painted, even if it's not all by his hand.
So you mentioned that perhaps 90% of it is not in his hand. Where would, if while looking at the portrait, while looking at it closely, taking a close look at it, and I'm thinking about our viewers now, what areas of the portrait itself would you point out as Bellini-esque, as conservation, restoration? What would we be looking at?
I think that's a really hard question since I'm not a conservator, but I do, one thing that strikes me when I look at it is that the crispest parts of the painting to my eye are the details on the edges. For example, the tapestry that I mentioned, or the textile that is sort of sitting beneath and in front of the Sultan. His face and his body are a little bit hazy and maybe less crisp and clean. And so, has there been excessive damage there? I think probably so. It may be that that's the place that's been the most reworked, which, it's an often sort of a unrecognized truism that paintings tend to be more, there tends to be more intervention on paintings that are either more famous and important, or on parts of paintings that are more important, because that's the part we care about. So this is a really interesting issue to me, the question of authenticity, right? And we tend to intervene more on things that are more important. So I think maybe the face has been more reworked because that's really should be the central part of the image. But it's something about the frame, especially beneath, that seems the most crisp and visually engaging to me.
Yeah, I think you can see that. That's great. All right, so let's talk then about this narrative just a little bit. And so the portrait of Mehmet II had a very interesting life of its own, and its own set of stories, which gets it from Istanbul to London. I'd like to ask about that. After the creation, the portrait's first trek was to Venice in 1481. And then there was no confirmable sighting, a confirmable, I think is the key word there, sighting of the portrait until 1865. So how did that work? That's almost 400 years of history. What happened?
That was a huge problem for me as a historian. I remember telling a friend of mine there was a gap in my narrative of 400 years, and she said, "That's not a gap, that's an abyss." So how do you deal with that time? We don't know when it left Istanbul. I think the most likely is that it left shortly after Mehmet died. His son Bayezid II was much less interested in art, maybe much more skeptical and maybe even critical of the value of objects like this one. And so got rid of a lot of the collections that Mehmet had. And so in this section of the book, I follow three slim leads that I think give us a sense of maybe where it went. And I posit that it was possibly in the collection of a Venetian family, because we have one reference in the 17th century that it was in the hands of a particular Venetian family. And so I think that's probably the most likely, that it ended up in a sort of noble household in Venice and just hung anonymously on a wall. There is a story that it came into the collection of someone named Paolo Giovio, who was a very important collector of portraits in the 16th century, in the mid, around 1540, 1550. I think, Giovio claims that he had this portrait, and there's really probably very little evidence that that's the case. He's probably elaborating, or he had some portrait that was related to it. So I explore that, but I dismiss that as a theory. And then there's a really tantalizing detail in that we know that the Ottomans, 100 years after Gentile Bellini went to Istanbul, the Ottomans sent a delegation under the directive of Murad III to Venice to look for authoritative portraits of the sultans, because they were making a new genealogical history of the Ottoman dynasty, and they wanted verifiable portraits. So to me, this was a very intriguing rumor, let's say, that Venice had authoritative portraits of sultans, and of course, one thinks of Bellini's picture. So we don't know, but it reappears on a sort of misty night in 1865. And, my suspicion is it was kind of housed in some noble households over those 400 years. I would love to find a smoking gun that would prove that, but haven't gotten there quite yet.
Perfect, wouldn't it? Well, that misty night in 1865 is where I wanted to move to next. And it brings in a character who I think our Antiquities Coalition audience might be well familiar with, and that's Austin Henry Laird, who of course we know as the excavator of the Syrian cities of Nineveh and Nimrud, and a 19th century Orientalist of the most vivid rank, I suppose we could say. Can you tell us about his entrance into the story and the role he plays?
Yeah, he writes this wonderful letter. I think it's to Giovanni Morelli, the connoisseur and a collector, describing one evening he had a palace in Venice, and he was trying to step into his gondola where he was approached by an Englishman, son of an Italian noble, from some sort of semi-noble family who had fallen on hard times and was trying to get rid of some of his patrimony. And so he said, hey, do you want to buy this painting from me? And so, he bought it off the street from some guy. That's what he tells us. But he immediately knew what it was. And this is what I said about the sort of afterlife. Even though the painting hadn't been seen for almost 400 years, people knew about it. Giorgio Vasari had written about it. Other sort of narrators of the Renaissance had written about Bellini's trip and the portrait of the Sultan. So this picture had a reputation, and Laird immediately knew what he had, or what he thought he had. And so immediately started writing people, bragging about this new acquisition. And it became really the pride of his collection, because in addition to being this archaeologist, as you mentioned, and interestingly, the ambassador to Constantinople 400 years after Gentile Bellini was there. So there are these nice sort of echoes in their life stories. He was also a collector of painting. And so, and very active in this period. And this became one of his prides, because it was a famous, renowned picture that just hadn't been seen for centuries.
You mentioned Morelli, and I know that Laird, in his treatment of or I understand from your book, again, I should say, that in his treatment of the painting that he did intervene a bit with it. And it gets me to a point that I wanted to make, I think that might be interesting for our audience, and that's the difference between conservation and restoration. Could you talk a little bit about that for us?
Mm-hmm. Well, and it also has to get to changing notions of value and issues of authenticity and so forth. But the 19th century approach to pictures, and Laird was very involved in this, and so was Morelli, more what we would call restoration, took this approach that you kind of wanted to remake something in a manner that seemed the most, I don't know, maybe heroicizing, or made the work as beautiful as it could possibly be. And often that could have a tangential relationship to what the artist himself produced. So we know, Morelli and his friends who were conservators, or restorers, I should say, would cut pictures down or add pieces of canvas to make the proportions better, or repaint things to make them look the way they thought they should. And so typically we think of that as a restoration, a more sort of bring it into a form that you think it should be in. Conservation today takes a more conservative view, I think, and is less willing to impose our own aesthetic judgments onto art objects. And there's lots of debates about, how far, can you get back to an original object? Do you accept interventions that have been put on a picture as part of its history? These are really sort of fascinating theoretical and I think even ethical debates in conservation. But the approach in Layard's day was, make it look as good as possible. And what was defined as good was, to a large extent, one's own aesthetic notions, and not necessarily those of the painter.
And that's fascinating, it really is. And I want to catch up on the narrative here just a bit. All right, so Laird and his wife, Lady Enid, pass away, and now we have World War I looming, and there's quite a legal battle that's brewing over where the portrait was headed. You quoted the British ambassador at the time, asserting that the Italians regarded the painting, quote, somewhat as the Athenians regarded the Elgin marbles. Now, this raises a question, of course. Could Italy make a successful claim that Bellini's painting was actually Italian national patrimony?
Right. So it's interesting because Laird died in the 1890s. His widow, Lady Enid, dies in Venice in 1912. And yes, the Laird collection was willed to the National Gallery in London. The National Gallery in London wants all the paintings. And Italy at this time is just starting to think about and trying to enact legislation that would prevent the export of national patrimony. And they tried doing this. There were, over the course of a decade and more, there were debates about how to go about this. And one approach, a law that was passed, I think it was Law 185 in 1902, the thought was, well, we'll just make a list of all the more important objects in private collections, and these will not be allowed to leave the country. And in fact, the Laird collection was there, and among the paintings on the list of things that could not leave was the Bellini portrait. This was much debated. It was problematic. There were all sorts of arguments about that sound very familiar to us today, even. For example, should the state be able to legislate what individuals do with their private property? Can they sell or not? Is that within the right of a government to tell an individual they can't sell a work? Debates around what is the value of cultural heritage for the people, right? That's a hard argument to make. I think it's a lot easier to argue about property than about kind of value of heritage for people. So there were a lot of arguments being batted about that sound just remarkably similar to some of the things we hear today. I think also the Italians, Italy hadn't been a nation state for terribly long. And it was not a very wealthy state, but it was very wealthy in terms of culture. So there was this sense that this is a way that we can build a sense of identity. Italy had also been a very fragmented entity, right? There were lots of sort of different city-states and republics coming together to make this artificial country. But we can pull on heritage as a way of binding ourselves together and having national pride, and even thinking of it as perhaps an economic resource. So there were efforts to bind objects to Italy. And in fact, the term used in Italian is vincolare, which means to chain something. So was this thing vincolato, was it chained to Italy? And this object, this painting was on this attempted list to keep things in Italy, but it didn't work, as we know, because it did end up in the National Gallery. So that's kind of a loophole story. And the story is that actually Laird had taken his collection to London earlier. In fact, he had taken this painting to London as soon as it was found. Well, the sort of fine print in the Italian legislation was this was did not apply to objects that had been imported to Italy. And this painting had come back into the country, therefore it was an import, therefore it's sort of a loophole in the law, and it left. But there was a sense that this was a really important picture to the Venetians, and in particular, and that they would be very upset if it were taken away. And there were even letters that you can find in the archives in the gallery saying, don't send the director down to Venice to deal with this because it's just going to be too visible, and we don't want to make, such a to-do. So it really was sort of seen as a very touchy, difficult object to take away from the Venetians, because it was seen as a key part of their patrimony.
Yeah. Well, it reminds us, of course, of what we do at the Antiquities Coalition. There's much of those. You're absolutely right. Those issues still resonate very strongly today with questions of repatriation, and they head towards issues of nationalism in some cases, and not in all, of course, and of course legal issues, which can get extremely complicated, and which at the Antiquities Coalition we try to work on to try to sort out as a reasonable standard for these sort of issues. So I want to bring us then to what might it doesn't quite close the circle, certainly, but it does get the portrait back to Istanbul, and that was in 1999 when it took a trip from London back to Istanbul. Can you tell me what happened and what was the reception when Turkey received this portrait of Mehmet II for the first time since it left?
Well, there was it was an exhibition that was organized in 1999 at a relatively modest sort of cultural arm of the Yapı Kredi Institute, which is a bank in Istanbul, and they had decided to try and bring the portrait back to Turkey. It had never come back, And there's a whole interesting series of letters in the National Archives, or in the National Gallery archives, about sort of the logistics and the arguments of why it should come back, and sort of the seals and stamps of approval from the Turkish government for this request. And it came back as a one painting show in this relatively modest gallery in the Beyoğlu district of Istanbul. And it was an exhibition in which at the center you had Bellini's portrait, and then on either side sort of photo panels, one dedicated to, the two characters with which we started this conversation, one dedicated to the painter and one dedicated to the patron. And they met at the center, and the only original work of art that was in the exhibition. And thousands of people came to visit this exhibition. The painting arrived in almost a sort of diplomatic retinue. There was a whole procession of it off the airplane. It was really treated as kind of an ambassador to come back to that sort of diplomatic tone in which we started. And it was a huge success. And people came from all over the country to see it. I talked to a scholar who's based in Ankara who remembers coming to see it. I think there was something, I don't remember the numbers off my top of my head, but thousands of people came into this little gallery space over the course of a month. And people were very excited to see it and talked about how they had known this image all their lives. It was sort of the definitive image in their minds of Fatih Mehmet, this very important figure in their own history, and that it really felt like a homecoming. And the headlines in newspapers are sort of like "Welcome Home Fatih" and "Second Conquest" and all these sorts of aggrandizing headlines. I spoke to one of the organizers of this exhibition, and he said to me he thinks it's a moment when Turkey sort of gained confidence in the international cultural world and felt like it could have a place on that stage. It was also the moment when Turkey was applying for membership in the European Union. So it was a moment of really great openness between Turkey and Europe. So it feels like a different moment than what we're living.
Right. Well, we all know that nationalist tendencies in Turkey are running hotter these days, and that brings me to another question, which is that I know there's a new image that resides in Turkey now, and that's of Mehmet and someone else. Can you tell us about that portrait as well?
So this is a portrait I've never seen. It was auctioned off last summer at Christie's, I believe. It had been sold a few years previously at Sotheby's. It's a double portrait. It shows Mehmet and another figure who has not been fully identified. There have been arguments that it's one of his sons, that it's another member of the Ottoman court, that it's a European noble or official dressed in a kind of Ottoman regalia. It's really not clear who it is, and it's not clear who the painter is. The best circumstances would be that it's, a workshop of Gentile. I don't know. Again, I haven't seen it. I suspect, from what I can tell, it's probably a portrait from the early 16th century, maybe in the circle of Gentile Bellini. But what's interesting is the municipality of Istanbul spent about $1 million to buy this picture in a moment in which, this is not a great time for economies worldwide, and the Turkish economy certainly has been struggling. And so to lay out this kind of money for a portrait about which we don't know very much was pretty impressive, and speaks to me about how the ongoing power of the image of Mehmet in the cultural imagination of Turks, even in 2020.
That's very interesting. One other question that I'd like to ask you, as you were writing this book, of course, ISIS was using cultural destruction to intimidate, to attack, and even to erase evidence of its enemies. And at the same time, arming its cause through cultural plunder, through cultural racketeering, as we call it at the Antiquities Coalition, and trafficking. How did this connect to you, and did it affect the research you were conducting?
Well, yes, as I mentioned in my book, I think in the introduction, I really remember vividly a day, it was 2015, and I had gone to work in the library at Johns Hopkins, and I was looking at I was reading Lairds memoirs and looking at images of some of his books, and I turned the page and there was an image of one of these winged bulls of the sort that he excavated, and it was the one that he brought to London. And it was the same day I had seen a very similar object on the front page of the newspaper being defaced by a militant, let's say, in Iraq. And so I just had this moment where, I had two reactions. One was this kind of guilty feeling that I was glad that some of these things had gotten to London. And of course, that played into my own, all the sort of conflicted thoughts we may have about the value of museums holding objects like this that have not been taken in the cleanest of circumstances, but feeling like, well, at least this thing isn't being attacked and destroyed. It's safe in London. But then it also, I guess even more powerfully, what I felt was the way that these objects kind of rise to the surface as important in moments and then, pass out of sight, but then can become central to our imaginations again. So this idea of the afterlife of the thing again, that this object was at the center of everyone's attention for a few days and had been so important to Laird. And it just gave me the sense of how objects continue to have such a powerful place in the way we understand so many elements of our daily lives, from our engagement with politics to the news, to how we feel about history and other people's. And so I just was really struck by the ongoing power of this ancient object and its sort of cousins that survive in images in books and in museums.
I want to just take a little detour here just briefly and to say that your reaction really is quite familiar. The destruction wrought by the so-called Islamic State at the museum in Mosul, along with the paroxysm of Library when they burnt the library to the ground that same week, was actually a seminal event in the AC's history. In the wake of that destruction, the Antiquities Coalition and our friends at the Council on Library and Information Resources, we sought to do something in response, and we conceived and created and founded the Digital Library of the Middle East, which is our online platform that federates and makes accessible digital records of cultural heritage material from around the Middle East and North Africa. We took that action inspired by what happened there. We wanted to do something and we wanted to respond. So that attack led directly to those efforts, which are ongoing today and result in our work right now that we do on digital infrastructure in Yemen and in Iraq and in Algeria. Well, Dr. Rodini, one of the great sites, of course, in Istanbul and one inhabited and used by Mehmet II is the Hagia Sophia, and its role has changed over the course of the years and has had a recent development where it has become a mosque again. It seems to me that there's elements of cultural heritage preservation and nationalism involved in that decision as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, there's a lot I could say. I mean, let's remember that it was Fatih Mehmet II who first made Hagia Sophia into a mosque, and then it was under Ataturk that it was made into a museum, and now it's back to standing as a mosque. So obviously this connects to some of the key figures in my book. I guess I would frame this question by taking a step back and actually acknowledging the last chapter of my book, in which I actually went to Istanbul and I talked to people about this painting. I did actually an online kind of survey, and I went and talked to people on the street. I do not speak Turkish. I had some wonderful interpreters, and I was trying to get a sense of what the painting means today, to people today, after that 1999 exhibition. And what I concluded was that it is a highly politicized image. So that in a nutshell, people on the, let's say, on the right who support the more conservative government of Recep Tayyip Erdogan tend to venerate the subject of Mehmet II as a sort of icon of Turkish identity. And some people would refer to this as a sort of neo-Ottomanism. And people on the left who are less comfortable with that kind of nationalist imagery are more skeptical about Fatih Mehmet, that he seems, not a hero, but someone who's more an oppressive sort of figure in their imaginations. And so I think when we look at what happened this summer with Hagia Sophia being reconstituted as a mosque, we have to frame it we may see it from our perspective as people interested in heritage as this sort of heritage issue, but I also think it's the larger arc of the history helps us see that there's also this very important internal discussion in Turkey about the status of monuments like this. And Erdogan said, when he proposed sanctioning religious services in Hagia Sophia, is that this is the way Fatih, conqueror of Istanbul, would have wanted it to be. So he's pulling on a really ancient dilemma or debate, I think, inside Turkey. So what's interesting to me is to think how it's operating within the Turkish context of debate, as well as on a larger, let's say, in a larger conversation about monuments and kind of who controls monuments. I think we need to keep those two issues both in mind, the international and the kind of national debate. So it's very relevant. And I don't want to express an opinion, but I'm very interested to see how it's going to play out.
So the lives and afterlives of the portrait continue on, and we can expect that there'll be more in the future, and we'll be able to follow the progress of the painting as it continues its active participation in the world. Dr. Rodini, by tracing the trajectory of this one object through history, you've really revealed great takeaways on the subjects of authenticity, on provenance, on diplomacy, and on national patrimony. And I want to say one of your phrases that struck me when you refer to the painting as, quote, a small detail that reveals a world of thinking. That's a goal you accomplished clearly and very well, I think. The book is Gentile, Bellini's portrait of Sultan Mehmet II, Lives and Afterlives of an Iconic Image. So author Dr. Elizabeth Rodini, a final word from you, Doctor.
Well, just to say thank you. It's been a pleasure. And I really appreciate you thinking of my subject in this context of let's say, heritage and the politics of heritage, because I don't think that's an approach that is typically considered. And I do appreciate you including me in your program of conversations. Thank you.
It's a pleasure and it's an honor, and it's benefits us all who are watching this. So thank you very much for joining us, audience. I'm Peter Herdrick from the Antiquities Coalition. We'll see you again here soon.